Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Now this is the GTX 1660, the baseline model of the 1660 series, positioned just below the Super and the top tier Ti. Back in 2019 this card was the sweet spot for PC builders with a couple of £100 or dollars to spend. It targeted gamers who wanted modern performance but weren't concerned about hardware based ray tracing introduced by the more expensive RTX 2060. These days you might find that the price difference between all of the aforementioned cards is minimal, but that will depend on where you live. Today I wanted to see if this once mainstream king with its 6 gigs of GDDR5 memory can still offer an acceptable gaming experience. I mentioned ray tracing just now, so let's start there. This Turing based card can technically utilise RT in certain titles via software emulation, though modern releases like Indiana Jones and the Great Circle or Metro Exodus Enhanced Edition require mandatory hardware cores and will completely refuse to launch. Now some games will work, like Cyberpunk 2077 for example, and I have to say that it isn't completely awful. That is a compliment, believe it or not, because I was expecting way less than 20 FPS from this 6GB card with ray tracing enabled, especially considering it has no RT cores. If you are thinking about a 1660 in 2026, then you probably won't be concerned with ray tracing, so we'll leave that there. Next, we'll see how the card performs in a handful of games at native 1080p and whether or not it can hit 60 FPS without any help from upscaling. If it can, what visual sacrifices does it need to get there? In a couple of instances I did enable FSR, but this was only when we couldn't get a playable 60 FPS out of this card even at the lowest in-game settings. Let's start with the good news. Competitive and older esports titles run really well on this card. In Counter-Strike 2 at the high preset, albeit with MSAA disabled, we saw 276 FPS on average. More importantly, the 1% lows stayed above 200 as well, delivering a buttery smooth and consistent experience. Fortnite with the medium preset also ran nicely, averaging a comfortable 133 frames per second. However, I did pick up on a few notable stutters as represented by the 0.1% low of 57, which isn't too unheard of for this Unreal Engine title, as we've seen in my other benchmark videos. GTA 5 Enhanced with the very high preset far exceeded our 60 FPS target with a smooth 88 frames per second, so if you plan on playing the Legacy or original release, then you should get even more out of this aging 6GB GPU. Moving on to more intensive titles, and the GTX 1660 still holds up surprisingly well in a lot of cases, providing you are willing to spend a couple of minutes tweaking the settings menu, or what I should say is turning things down to low. Our standard 1660 managed to achieve 75 FPS average in Cyberpunk using the low preset, which combines mostly low with a few medium options. I also bumped the crowd density up to medium, but this is more of a CPU intensive option, so if you plan on pairing this card with a more entry level processor, you may want to keep this at low as well. Anyway, the percentile lows were also pretty good here, coming in at 61 and 57, so very consistent overall. I thought Forza Horizon 6 would struggle more than it did with this card, mainly because of the limited VRAM, but it was perfectly playable at medium with TAA. We're looking at 74 FPS here with consistent percentile lows yet again. I don't think it's worth trying to go for the high preset, as we may see 60 FPS occasionally, but it won't be anywhere near as smooth. I'd rather have better consistency and fluidity in a racing game than slightly improved visuals, but it's all down to personal preference. I also stuck with the medium preset in Ark Raiders, which sat between 60 and 70 FPS most of the time. Upscaling options are of course available here, just like with most if not all of the other games tested today, but it's nice to see this one performing fairly well natively on this half-decade old mainstream GPU. Battlefield 6 is best enjoyed at low, but to be honest it still looks pretty good and performance was acceptable despite a couple of drops. The 6 gigs of VRAM will start to choke when we crank things up to medium with or without upscaling. Of course the high-res textures are not installed here, and I'd advise avoiding them unless you have a card with 16GB of VRAM and you intend to play at 1440p or 2160p. Neither of those two resolutions I'd suggest with a 1660. Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 is also best enjoyed at low, as higher presets will cause some noticeable drops, especially in towns and in the woods. Even with the low preset, we saw a few little hiccups here and there. This is one of those titles where a lack of VRAM will become quite apparent very quickly, with slow loading textures and intermittent stutters becoming quite frequent with the more intensive presets. In Red Dead Redemption 2, I went with one of my go-to options for budget cards in terms of the visuals, which is basically the ultra textures and everything else set to medium. Now, by keeping the textures on ultra, the game still looks sharp, and the medium settings elsewhere are a nice, well, middle ground that combines performance and visual fidelity. Another choice is, of course, the console equivalent settings, which would also be a suitable option for this GPU. Resident Evil Requiem forced me all the way down to the lowest preset. Once again, I had to strip back the lighting and shadow quality as well in order to scrape past our 60 FPS target. That said, if you have 30 or even 40 FPS in mind, then you've certainly got more headroom with this card in 2026. Sometimes though, this 6GB GPU can't always manage that, and such scenarios will probably become more common over the next couple of years when it comes to AAA releases. Remember when I mentioned utilising upscaling as a last resort at the beginning? Well, we had no choice but to deploy it for the final two games. 007 First Light requires FSR balanced mode on top of the lowest preset for 60 frames per second, though I'm surprised this made such a difference because at native resolution with no upscaling, even 30 FPS was a struggle. Finally, Crimson Desert proved to be the ultimate stress test for this aging card. Even after dropping to the low preset and enabling FSR 3.1 quality, this card managed just 49 FPS on average, with percentile lows dipping into the 30s. The minimum graphics option didn't really change much, neither did more aggressive upscaling presets, so I thought we may as well just enjoy slightly better visuals with less of a sacrifice to the resolution. There were barely a couple of frames in it. I think this is more of a VRAM issue here. Now overall, I think the standard 1660 here did pretty well today. 7 years after its launch, this card is definitely showing its age, but it refuses to go down without a fight. If your games library consists of older titles, esports games like Counter-Strike 2 and Fortnite, or well-optimised releases like Forza Horizon, then this card can still deliver an acceptable 1080p 60fps gaming experience. Sure, performance may fall apart a bit with some of the latest AAA releases, and its frame rate woes are only going to get worse over the next couple of years. But look at it this way, if I paid 200 quid for this card back in 2019, I'd be absolutely thrilled with how well that investment has held up. Frankly, if you can pick up one of these for less than half that price today, you'd still walk away pretty happy, I think. But thanks for watching. Let me know your thoughts down below, and as always, I hope to see all of you in the next one.